It begins, as many quiet disturbances do, with a number that does not belong, deep inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, where parchment dust hangs in filtered light and temperature is treated as doctrine. Catalog entries follow a choreography refined over centuries. Each ledger rests precisely where it should, each folio nested within its assigned lineage. The 14th century Templar volumes are no exception. Trial transcripts, financial inventories, correspondence with uneasy monarchs. Nothing in their sequence suggests surprise. And yet, tucked between requisition lists and notarized confessions, one reference refuses to sit still. The entry is brief, clinical. A secondary notation appended in later ink. Appendix, custodial materials, Jerusalem. No elaboration, no cross-reference, no description of material type. In an archive where even fragments of wax seals receive paragraphs of classification, the silence is conspicuous. Officially, scholars assume it to be a filing error. Medieval archives were copied, recopied, translated, rebound, marginal annotations drifted. A misplaced appendix is hardly scandalous. The Church has long acknowledged the complexity of preserving a millennium of paper memory, but the unease begins with the phrasing. Custodial materials appears nowhere else in the Templar corpus, not in inventories of relics, not in confiscation records following the arrests of 1307. Nowhere. The term surfaces only centuries later in theological contexts, implying stewardship of something sensitive, something not yet disclosed. Why would a biological implication, suggested only through modern translation, cling to a Templar ledger at all? Researchers who notice the anomaly describe a hesitation among archivists when the entry is mentioned, not denial, not confirmation, a pause, as if the catalog itself is remembering something no one has fully read. Was it a clerical slip, a deliberate misdirection, or a trace left by hands that expected one day to be questioned? The letters are thin, brittle, and written in a hand that feels hurried, as if the ink itself feared interruption. They surface not in Jerusalem, but in European monastic collections. Fragmentary correspondence between Templar commanders stationed in the Holy Land and their superiors across the sea. Official history tells us the order's presence beneath the Temple Mount was strategic. They were guardians of pilgrimage routes, financiers of crusading campaigns, tenants of a politically sensitive plateau. Excavation in the modern archaeological sense was not their mandate. Yet the letters suggest otherwise. Phrases recur in coded shorthand. Lower vaults opened, stone corridors beneath the mount, chambers undisturbed since the ancients. One line, partially eroded by water damage, refers to relics of origin secured from the deep. The wording is peculiar. Medieval relics are almost always named: bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, shards of sacred vessels. Here the object resists specificity. Officially, no excavation permits survive from the period. Ottoman authorities had not yet assumed control, but local custodians maintained records of structural alterations to sacred sites. None mentioned Templar digging. No transport manifests list recovered artifacts. When the order was dissolved, their properties were inventoried with bureaucratic thoroughness. No subterranean findings appear, and that absence should reassure us. It aligns neatly with the assumption that the letters exaggerate devotional exploration, perhaps spiritual metaphor mistaken for material action. Medieval writers often describe theological discovery in architectural language, but the contradiction lingers. If nothing was removed, why write of securing it? If nothing was found, why avoid naming it? More unsettling still is the pattern of later silence. After the arrest of 1307, correspondence ceases abruptly. The vocabulary of vaults and origins vanishes from surviving texts. Either the discoveries were insignificant and forgotten, or they were significant enough to disappear. And if something was carried out from beneath the mount, it left no footprint, only a question that the archive cannot inventory. The reference appears where no one expects it, inside a 17th century theological index devoted entirely to doctrinal disputes. Bound in calfskin and catalogued among treatises on heresy, the volume is not scientific. It concerns transubstantiation, angelology, the mechanics of divine order. Yet midway through a densely footnoted entry on prelapsarian humanity, a marginal notation interrupts the rhythm of abstraction: custodia separata exemplaria lineae primordialis, separate custody, samples of the primordial line. Officially, scholars interpret such phrasing as allegorical. The 1600s were rich with metaphor. Lineage could signify spiritual descent from Adam. Samples might indicate textual exemplars, copied genealogies preserved apart from apocryphal contamination. The church guarded manuscripts fiercely, and separation was often about orthodoxy, not matter. But the destabilizing detail lies in the word exemplaria. In other contexts of the same index, exemplaria refers to physical specimens, wax impressions, mineral fragments, botanical clippings used in theological argument. The term shifts meaning depending on what is being defended. Here, its application to primordial line feels uncomfortably literal. More curious still is the instruction that these materials are stored non cum reliquies, not with relics. Relics were bones, hair, preserved tissue, holy matter venerated publicly. If these were symbolic documents, why insist on separating them from sacred remains? And if they were material, yet what category did they occupy that required a different vault? No accompanying description survives. No inventory item clarifies the nature of the custody. The index offers only the suggestion of containment, not the contents themselves. Perhaps it was rhetoric, an ornate flourish in an era intoxicated by layered meaning, or perhaps, centuries before genetics found its language, something tangible was placed behind a door labeled theology, waiting for a science that did not yet exist. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, doors were struck before dawn. Across France, Knights Templar were pulled from their beds, shackled, and marched into stone chambers where questions waited sharper than blades. The official narrative is familiar: accusations of heresy, idolatry, secret rites performed in candlelit halls. Under pressure, sometimes under torture, confessions were extracted, recorded, sealed. The transcripts survive in meticulous detail. Charges are enumerated. Denials are crossed out. Oaths are described with almost obsessive care. We know for what the interrogators wanted to hear, but we do not hear about Jerusalem. For nearly 2 centuries, the order had maintained a presence in the Holy Land. They had occupied the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed to stand atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. They had dug foundations, reinforced tunnels, fortified subterranean corridors. These facts are not disputed. Yet, when the trials unfold, the Eastern expeditions barely surface, not in the accusations, not in the confessions. It is an absence that feels engineered. One might assume the crown cared only for wealth and power, much that theological deviations were sufficient grounds for dissolution. The Church, too, may have preferred to frame the narrative around doctrinal corruption rather than archaeological curiosity. Excavations beneath sacred ground would have complicated jurisdiction, ownership, perhaps even belief. And then there's the possibility that the Templars themselves withheld something. Under interrogation, they confess to spitting on crosses and denying Christ, charges likely coerced. But on matters of their time beneath the mount, they are silent. Was it irrelevance or discipline? The records speak loudly of ritual, but whisper nothing of what lay beneath Jerusalem's stone. In trials designed to expose secrets, why does the deepest ground remain untouched? If the official pages are careful, the margins are restless. Surviving Templar manuscripts, prayer books, financial ledgers, copied sermons appear ordinary at first glance. Their Latin is competent, their illuminations restrained, yet along the edges, squeezed between decorative flourishes and accounting tallies, smaller hands have written in a script that does not quite belong, or the Church has long acknowledged the presence of marginalia in medieval texts. Monks debated theology in cramped side notes. Scribes corrected errors. Later readers inserted glosses. Most of it is devotional, sometimes argumentative, rarely consequential. But in several Templar volumes, the marginal script shifts into something else. Certain phrases repeat custodes vigilantes, sanguinis linea custodita, the watchers, the guarded bloodline. Official translators render these as spiritual metaphors. Watchers can signify angels drawn from apocryphal texts. Bloodline may refer to Christ's genealogy or to the spiritual lineage of believers. In a religious order sworn to vigilance, such language is not inherently alarming. And yet, the structure of the notes resists simplicity. The script alternates between Latin and a cipher built from displaced letters and numerical substitutions. Words are fragmented across lines, sometimes mirrored, sometimes inverted. Portions decode cleanly, others dissolve into partial syllables. It is not a code designed for ornament. It feels intentional, layered. More unsettling is the consistency. Different manuscripts, different hands, same recurring pairings, watchers in blood, guarded in origin. If these were metaphors, why encrypt them? And the Templars were not shy about mystical language in public liturgy. Why conceal allegory and arithmetic? Scholars attempting full translation reach impasses. Key terms decode into ambiguities. Custodia could mean protection or confinement. Linea might be descent, thread, or boundary. Each translation opens multiple paths and closes none. Were the margins preserving theology too controversial to print openly, or recording something they feared would be read too plainly? The code remains incomplete, as though a final key was never meant to survive. Before the arrests began, before dawn knocks shattered stone corridors, something else moved quietly along the Atlantic coast. La Rochelle was the Templars' maritime stronghold, a fortified harbor, discreet and efficient. It is officially recorded as a commercial hub, a place where grain, wool, and coin shifted between kingdoms. The order ships were practical vessels built for transport and supply, not legend. And yet, in the weeks preceding October 1307, chroniclers note unusual departures. Not one ship, but several. Leaving at staggered intervals, no public declarations, no recorded cargo lists. The assumption is mundane, assets repositioned in response to mounting tension with the French crown. Rumors of impending arrests may have reached them. A prudent order would secure its wealth. But here the record thins. When royal agents seized Templar properties, they found treasure in chests, yes, but not the full maritime inventory. Contemporary observers remarked, almost in passing, that certain vessels were absent from harbor. No manifests survived detailing what they carried. No port records confirm their arrival elsewhere. It is possible they were lost to storms. Medieval seas were indifferent to secrecy. Yet decades later, within Vatican archival registers, a subtle anomaly appears, a cluster of acquisitions labeled generically as transferred holdings, Western provenance. No origin port specified, no donor listed. The church did absorb former Templar assets. That much is uncontested, but the timeline is uneasy. The unexplained acquisition surface years after the fleet vanished, cataloged with a vagueness uncommon for financial transfers. If treasure was moved, it should leave an accounting trail. If relics were transported, they should enter inventories. But if the cargo was neither coin nor bone, something more difficult to classify, how would it be recorded? The ship's left without witnesses. The archive later expands without explanation. And between those two silences lies open water. The word Anunnaki enters most conversations as myth, winged figures etched into clay, towering beings descending from the heavens, stories carved in cuneiform and buried beneath Mesopotamian sand. Official scholarship frames them as divine archetypes, expressions of cosmic order in a world still learning how to write its fears and its harvests. In museums, the tablets are labeled accordingly: mythology, cosmology, ritual text. But something shifts when the stories are read not as allegory, but as record. The Sumerian king list, for instance, does not begin with metaphor. It begins with reigns, names, durations measured not in vague epochs, but in counted years, some impossibly long, yes, but structured. Kingship descended from heaven. Then rulers are enumerated, city by city, lineage by lineage. It sounds less like poetry and more like administration. The destabilizing moment arrives when those sequences are placed beside another genealogy, one more familiar to the Western archive. Biblical patriarchs, too, are assigned extraordinary lifespans: Adam, Seth, Enosh, a narrowing descent through named fathers and sons, years tallied with solemn precision. Officially, parallels are attributed to shared ancient storytelling traditions, flood narratives, extended lifespans, divine ancestry. These motifs circulated widely across the Near East. Cultural borrowing explains similarity without requiring continuity. Yet the structural rhythm is difficult to ignore. Both corpora move from divine proximity to human dilution. Both trace authority through blood. Both imply that what began above gradually settled into ordinary flesh. If the Anunnaki were purely symbolic, why anchor them to cities and reigns? If the genealogies were purely theological, why quantify descent so carefully? No tablet declares historical continuity. No scripture confirms shared ancestry. But between myth and record lies a narrow corridor where language behaves like memory. And the question lingers quietly. Were these stories preserving belief or preserving lineage? The clay tablets speak of seed. It is a small word, easily spiritualized. In agricultural societies, seed meant sustenance, continuity, divine blessing. When ancient scribes described God's planting seed among humanity, official translations lean toward metaphor, fertility rites, symbolic creation, mythic dramatization of order emerging from chaos. That is the accepted frame. Yet certain tablets complicate it. In fragments attributed to Akkadian and late Sumerian periods, phrases emerge describing the mixing of divine seed with that of humankind. Another text refers to beings who were fashioned or crafted to serve. The verbs used, epeshu, banu, can mean to make, to build, to construct. Scholars debate the nuance endlessly. To craft a being in ancient literature often signifies divine authorship, not laboratory procedure. Gods shape humanity from clay, and this is standard cosmology. The language is ritual, not technical, but the destabilizing detail lies in repetition. The motif of alteration, of something modified, adjusted, engineered for function, appears across multiple tablets, is separated by centuries. In one fragment, the word for seed is paired with a term that can imply purity or strain. In another, lineage is described as stabilized after conflict among the gods. Are these poetic flourishes, or is modern discomfort guiding translation away from biological possibility? Linguists caution against anachronism. Genetics is a 19th century science. To read DNA into Bronze Age vocabulary risks projection. We must not impose laboratories onto ziggurats, and yet the ancients were precise observers. They bred animals, they selected crops, they understood inheritance long before they understood chromosomes. When a tablet speaks of seed altered for labor, are we hearing theology or the earliest language available for intervention? The clay does not clarify. It preserves ambiguity with unnerving patience. At first, the resemblance feels coincidental. A medieval order in Europe, writing in ciphered Latin. Bronze Age scribes pressing symbols into wet clay, separated by millennia, language families, cosmologies. Any overlap should dissolve under scrutiny, and yet certain terms echo. In Templar marginalia, we encounter custodes, watchers, guardians, those who observe. In Mesopotamian texts, the Apkallu and the Watchers appear as intermediaries between divine and human realms. The linguistic roots differ, but the conceptual role aligns. Beings tasked with oversight, transmission, boundary maintenance. Officially, such parallels are categorized as archetypal recurrence. Civilizations independently generate guardian figures. The human mind favors hierarchies between heaven and earth. Similar metaphors do not require secret inheritance, but the destabilizing pattern lies deeper than metaphor. Use Templar cipher fragments repeatedly pair watchers with blood, linea sanguinis custodita, guarded lineage. In certain Mesopotamian passages, the watchers are associated not merely with teaching, but with the regulation of descent, the preservation of particular lines after divine human unions. Individually, each corpus is interpretable within its own context. Together, the vocabulary forms a lattice of uncomfortable symmetry. Could medieval scholars have accessed translated Near Eastern traditions? Fragments of ancient knowledge did filter through Islamic scholarship into Europe. It is not impossible that esoteric motifs traveled alongside mathematics and astronomy. Yet no documented Templar library lists Sumerian tablets. No inventory records cuneiform study. So are we witnessing transmission without trace? Or are modern readers threading connections between distant texts because we are primed to see patterns? The words align, but alignment is not evidence. Still, when separate archives describe watchers guarding blood across centuries of silence, coincidence begins to feel curated. And the margins, once again, refuse to stay decorative. There are saints who did not decay. Medieval pilgrims traveled across continents to glimpse bodies said to resist corruption. Flesh unspoiled, skin supple, centuries after death. Officially, these phenomena were framed as miracles. Incorruptibility signaled divine favor, a suspension of natural law granted to the holy. Church records describe the scent of flowers emanating from tombs, limbs flexible long after burial, wounds that appeared moist as if newly made. Some relics were even reported to bleed when disturbed, exuding darkened liquid beneath chapel light. Modern historians attribute such accounts to exaggeration, devotional fervor, or environmental coincidence. Certain burial conditions, dry crypts, Mineral-rich soil, low oxygen can slow decomposition. Wax coatings and resins were sometimes applied to enhance presentation. Medieval embalmers possessed more practical knowledge than we often credit, and yet the destabilizing detail is consistency. The descriptions of preservation appear across regions and centuries with technical specificity. References to sealed containers, layered wrappings, aromatic compounds used not merely for scent, but for stabilization. In some cases, tissues were removed, separated, stored individually. Officially, these were acts of veneration. But separation is also a form of method. Could early custodians have stumbled upon preservation techniques capable of protecting more than symbolic matter? We know DNA can survive in bone for millennia under certain conditions. We know soft tissue rarely endures, but occasionally does. The church never claimed scientific intention. The language remains devotional. Still, when relics are described as resisting time, one wonders whether preservation was entirely accidental or whether somewhere between faith and practice, someone learned how to keep more than memory intact. By the 16th century, curiosity had acquired instruments. The Society of Jesus, founded in discipline, trained in rigor, became one of the most scientifically literate bodies within the church. Officially, the Jesuits pursued astronomy, mathematics, botany, cartography, and they mapped the heavens from China, cataloged plants in the Americas, dissected specimens in quiet European rooms. Their laboratories were not secret. They were extensions of scholarship. Preservation became necessity. Exotic flora decayed quickly during transport. Anatomical specimens required stabilization for study. Jesuit manuals describe distillation techniques, alcohol-based suspensions, herbal resins formulated to inhibit rot. They experimented with controlled environments, aware that temperature and humidity shape survival. None of this is controversial. The church's engagement with empirical science is well documented, complex, but real. The destabilizing moment arrives when we notice how early this expertise matured. By the 17th century, Jesuit scholars understood tissue differentiation. They preserved organs for anatomical instruction. They observed blood under magnification. Once microscopes emerged, they corresponded across continents, sharing methods discreetly but efficiently. And yet no surviving document explicitly links these laboratories to anything recovered from Jerusalem. There is no memorandum describing analysis of ancient remains, no cross-reference between Templar holdings and Jesuit experimentation. Capability exists, documentation does not. One might argue that absence proves separation. The Order of the Temple dissolved 2 centuries before the Society of Jesus was founded. Institutional continuity is not automatic. But the Vatican archives are cumulative. Materials flow inward, rarely outward. If unusual specimens had entered custody earlier, later scholars would at least encounter them. So unless access was restricted, unless preservation preceded explanation. The Jesuits refined techniques capable of stabilizing organic matter. That much is clear. What remains unclear is whether they ever applied that knowledge to something older, something already waiting in a vault labeled theology. In the 19th century, the Vatican reorganized its memory. Industrialization had altered Europe. Climate science was emerging. Preservation shifted from reverence to regulation. Architectural blueprints from this period reveal renovations to the apostolic archive. Thicker walls, reinforced shelving, improved ventilation. One annex, however, appears different. The plans show a sealed wing constructed with double-door vestibules and unusually narrow windows. Annotations indicate aeration control and temperature stabilization beyond what parchment typically requires. The language is technical, not devotional. Officially, such modifications are easily explained. Old manuscripts are fragile. Mold thrives in humidity. Ink fades under fluctuation. Creating microclimates would have been prudent modernization. Yet the destabilizing detail is proportion. The annex is small relative to the archive, but its insulation exceeds that of larger manuscript halls. Airflow channels are segmented, access corridors are limited. No catalog designation accompanies the wing in public finding aids of the era. If it housed rare papal bulls or delicate codices, one might expect celebratory documentation. Instead, there is silence. Some historians suggest it stored diplomatic correspondence, materials too sensitive for general access. Others speculate it protected artifacts awaiting restoration. But climate control is not neutral. Temperature stability is crucial for organic preservation beyond paper. Bone, tissue, even sealed containers of biological material require consistency to endure. There is no record stating the annex safeguarded anything living or once living. There is also no record clarifying what justified such precaution. The blueprints remain, the purpose does not. And when architecture anticipates fragility without naming it, the walls themselves begin to feel like evidence holding something whose description never entered ink. When the Human Genome Project was announced, it was framed as a scientific milestone, a global collaboration to map the code of human life. Laboratories across continents synchronized effort, sequencing billions of base pairs with cautious optimism. Officially, it was medicine's future unfolding in real time. The Vatican responded as expected through theology. Public statements emphasized dignity, the sanctity of the person, the danger of reducing humanity to data. Pontifical councils convened bioethics panels. Conferences were held in Rome where geneticists and clerics shared podiums discussing cloning, manipulation, the moral boundaries of intervention. On the surface, the engagement appeared reactive. The Church has long commented on emerging sciences, offering ethical frameworks rather than technical input. That is the documented posture. But the destabilizing detail lies in the fluency. Certain Vatican scholars spoke with unusual precision about genomic complexity, about non-coding regions, mutational drift, ancestral markers. Their language suggested familiarity beyond philosophical abstraction. They asked questions not only about what sequencing would reveal, but about what it might confirm. Privately, consultative meetings were acknowledged, but not detailed. Scientists describe them as collegial exchanges. No transcripts were published. No technical papers emerged bearing Vatican affiliation. One might interpret this as prudence. Religious institutions are careful with language. Engagement does not imply foreknowledge, and yet, if an institution had long contemplated lineage in biological terms, if somewhere within its archives were materials interpreted as ancestral records, the mapping of the human genome would not be merely academic, it would be comparative. Officially, there is no evidence the Vatican possessed genetic data predating modern science. Still, when the Code of Humanity was unveiled, the Church did not react with surprise. It responded as though it had been waiting to see whether the map would align with something already imagined. In the margins of mainstream genetics, there are claims that refuse to settle. Haplogroups, clusters of inherited genetic markers, are used to trace migration and ancestry. Officially, they map humanity's slow dispersal from Africa, branching across continents in patterns supported by archaeology and linguistics. The framework is robust, refined by decades of data, and yet occasionally anomalies surface. Fringe researchers point to rare genetic sequences that appear isolated, markers that do not fit cleanly into established trees. They describe them as orphan haplotypes, fragments without obvious lineage. Some speculate wildly, invoking non-terrestrial origins or engineered interference. Most of these claims collapse under scrutiny. Sample sizes are small. Contamination is common. Statistical noise masquerades as revelation. Peer review dismisses extraterrestrial speculation as sensationalism untethered from evidence. Still, the destabilizing detail is persistence. A handful of anomalies resist immediate classification. Not alien, not miraculous, simply unusual. Geneticists acknowledge that our map is incomplete. Ancient migrations, extinct populations, undiscovered bottlenecks could account for the irregularities. Science tolerates uncertainty, but uncertainty also invites narrative. If an institution had preserved ancient biological material, if samples existed predating known genealogical frameworks, modern sequencing might encounter signatures difficult to contextualize. There's no verified link between anomalous haplogroups and hidden archives. The suggestion remains speculative. Yet when rare markers appear without clear ancestry, they remind us that human history is not fully charted. And in that uncharted space, imagination and possibility begin to overlap. The reports are brief, almost casual. In the early 21st century, select geneticists were invited to closed symposia within Vatican walls. The stated purpose: dialogue on ancient DNA, preservation ethics, and the theological implications of deep ancestry. Such meetings are not unprecedented, and the Church frequently hosts interdisciplinary gatherings. Official summaries mention cordial discussion, mutual respect, shared concern for responsible science. But there are no transcripts, no recorded presentations, no published proceedings. Attendees, when asked, describe the conversations as confidential and contextual. They speak carefully, as though recalling something both ordinary and sensitive. The destabilizing detail is specificity without documentation. Ancient DNA is a specialized field. Extracting genetic material from bone or tissue thousands of years old requires precise conditions. It is not a topic typically addressed in broad theological forums. Why convene experts on degradation rates and mitochondrial inheritance in such a private setting? One explanation is prudence. Discussions touching on human origins can inflame misunderstanding. Confidentiality prevents misinterpretation. Another possibility is simpler. Institutions explore before they declare. If the Vatican possessed no biological materials of historical interest, the dialogue would remain purely hypothetical. Ethical foresight, nothing more. But if something existed, sealed, preserved, untested, the sequencing revolution would present both opportunity and risk. No evidence confirms that samples were offered. No scientist has claimed to analyze Vatican-held material. What remains is absence. When knowledge is shared publicly, it leaves citation. When it is shared privately, it leaves only memory. And memory, unlike transcript, cannot be audited. At the heart of Christian doctrine stands a declaration, both simple and immense. Humanity is created, not assembled, not modified, created. Imago Dei, bearing the image of God. Official Catechism affirms divine authorship of the human soul, while allowing for interpretive nuance in the mechanisms of physical formation. Evolution, cautiously integrated over the past century, is framed not as contradiction, but as instrument. The Church has shown elasticity before. Genesis, once read as literal chronology, now often occupies symbolic terrain. Days become epics. Dust becomes metaphor for materiality. Theological scholarship has grown comfortable with layered meaning. Doctrine bends where it must without conceding its core. But the destabilizing question emerges when ancestry is imagined not merely as evolved, but engineered. If evidence surfaced suggesting intervention by non human intelligence in early human development, where would doctrine rest? Creation through natural process is one matter. Creation mediated by another agent entirely, one described in ancient texts as watcher, guardian, progenitor, introduces hierarchy between God and intermediary. Officially, such speculation is unnecessary. There is no verified proof of engineered descent. Theology need not address hypotheticals untethered from evidence, and yet theology has always anticipated possibility. Angelology, for instance, accommodates beings who act within material history. The concept of secondary causes allows divine will to operate through created agents. And could such frameworks stretch further without fracturing? Or would engineered ancestry imply authorship displaced? Humanity shaped not solely by divine intention, but by delegated or even rebellious hands. The Church's interpretive flexibility is both strength and boundary. It can absorb metaphor, reconcile science, contextualize myth. But if lineage itself were redefined, elasticity might meet resistance. The ambiguity lies not in belief versus disbelief, but in how much reinterpretation faith can endure before it becomes something else entirely. In the mid-1800s, a Monsignor of modest reputation drafted a commentary few were meant to read. The manuscript, cataloged briefly before disappearing from circulation, bore a cautious title on pre-Adamic custodians. Official summaries describe it as speculative theology, an exploration of beings who may have preceded or guided early humanity without contradicting scriptural authority. The language was measured. The Monsignor did not deny Adam. He suggested instead that divine governance might have included intermediary stewards, custodians tasked with preparing the world for human arrival. Such ideas were not entirely unprecedented. Debates about pre-Adamite races had surfaced in Protestant circles, often entangled with troubling social theories. The Church generally distanced itself from these claims, wary of doctrinal instability. What unsettles is not the content, but the disappearance. The manuscript was referenced in a diocesan registry, then withdrawn. No formal condemnation survives. No record of heresy proceedings. It simply ceased to circulate. Requests to consult it were reportedly declined on grounds of insufficient relevance. One explanation is embarrassment. The work may have been poorly argued, redundant, or speculative beyond prudence. Another possibility is caution. If the commentary touched too closely on themes already considered sensitive, lineage, intermediaries, custodians of early humanity, it may have brushed against questions better left unopened. Suppression implies danger. Irrelevance implies neglect. Without the text itself, we cannot know which verdict applied. What remains is a title hinting at guardians before Adam, and a silence that feels more deliberate than accidental. Institutions survive by choosing when to speak. The Vatican has navigated centuries of upheaval. Astronomy overturning geocentrism, textual criticism dissecting scripture, evolutionary theory reframing origins. In each case, initial hesitation gave way to gradual engagement. Silence preceded recalibration. Officially, restraint is prudence. Premature declarations are risk error. The Church often waits for consensus before offering interpretation, preserving authority by avoiding reactionary claims. This pattern is documented. Galileo's controversy unfolded slowly, shaped as much by politics as physics. Apocryphal Gospels were studied quietly before public clarification. In each episode, quiet was not always concealment, it was a strategy. But the destabilizing question emerges when silence persists beyond transition. If engineered ancestry were even hypothetically plausible, so if ancient biological materials existed within ecclesiastical custody, the stakes would exceed academic debate. Disclosure could destabilize not only doctrine, but identity. Institutional quiet might then serve dual purpose, protecting believers from confusion and protecting knowledge from misinterpretation. Yet silence also invites projection. When archives remain closed, imagination fills the space. The absence of denial becomes suggestive. The absence of confirmation becomes louder than statement. Is the Vatican's restraint simply continuity of habit, a centuries-old rhythm of caution? Or does prolonged quiet indicate stewardship of information deemed too volatile for premature release? Without explicit claim, the silence cannot be interrogated directly. It can only be observed, and in matters of faith and dissent, observation often feels like listening at a door that may never open. The records surface not in Rome, but in Istanbul. Digitized Ottoman archives, long overlooked by Western researchers, contain administrative requests filed by foreign clerics seeking access to substructures beneath Jerusalem's most contested ground. Officially, such petitions were routine. European religious figures frequently negotiated for restoration rights, structural surveys, limited inspections of aging foundations. The empire documented everything. These particular entries, however, are incomplete. They reference European emissaries, names partially obscured by damaged ink, requesting supervised entry into lower chambers contiguous to ancient foundations. The language is bureaucratic, dry, stripped of theological flourish. Permits appear granted with conditions, limited duration, oversight required, no structural alteration, and then the detail fades. No follow-up reports describe what was found. No inventories list recovered objects. Marginal notations indicating completion are absent. The documents stop at permission, not outcome. Official historians caution against speculation. Ottoman record-keeping was meticulous, but not immune to loss. Fires, wars, bureaucratic transition, many files are fragmentary. Absence of detail does not imply concealment, yet the destabilizing element lies in timing. Several of these permits date decades after the dissolution of the Knights Templar, during periods when European religious orders sought renewed presence in the Holy Land. The requests focus specifically on subterranean access, not chapels, not surface repairs. If nothing of significance remained beneath those stones, why persist in seeking entry? The fragments confirm activity without describing purpose. They suggest movement in spaces long rumored but rarely documented. Perhaps the inspections were routine, structural, and mundane. Or perhaps they were searches, quiet attempts to verify whether something once secured had been removed or still lingered beneath sacred earth. The archive offers permission. It withholds discovery. In a quiet monastery in northern Italy, an inventory ledger from the late 1700s lists an unusual entry between chalices and illuminated manuscripts. Appears a brief notation, Terra Sancta Sigillata, holy soil sealed. Officially, such items were common devotional objects. Pilgrims carried earth from Jerusalem as blessing and memory. Monasteries preserved small quantities as symbolic connection to sacred ground. There is nothing inherently mysterious about soil, but the phrasing unsettles. Most entries in the ledger describe relics with ornamental language, fragments of stone, cloth touched to shrines, vials of oil. This entry, by contrast, is clinical. No mention of provenance shrine, no description of container beyond sealed, no devotional annotation. Sealed soil suggests containment beyond ceremony. The destabilizing detail lies in adjacent entries. Nearby, the ledger lists botanical specimens stored in glass labeled with origin and preservation method. The scribe uses similar terminology: sealed, cataloged, isolated. In those cases, the purpose is scientific study. Why mirror that language for soil? One explanation is coincidence. The same hand recorded both devotional and botanical materials, habit-shaped vocabulary. Yash Terra Sancta may have been nothing more than compacted earth from a pilgrimage route. Yet there is no later record of its use in liturgy, no notation of dispersal. The entry vanishes from subsequent inventories. If symbolic, it would likely have been shared, distributed, commemorated. If scientific, it would require analysis or concealment. The monastery's archives contain no reference to examination. What remains is a sealed quantity of earth, cataloged with unusual precision, and then forgotten in ink. Was it simply soil, or soil containing something no one wished to describe directly? The claim appears online, detached from institutional affiliation. An anonymous researcher states that a European laboratory conducted carbon dating on organic material associated with a Vatican-held source. No specimen name is provided. It has no accession number, only a vague description. Desiccated tissue fragment of indeterminate origin. Officially, such anonymity undermines credibility. Scientific procedure requires transparency, chain of custody, peer review, published methodology. Without documentation, the claim dissolves into rumor, yet the destabilizing detail is restraint. The anonymous account does not assert alien origin or sensational conclusion. It reports inconclusive results. The sample allegedly yielded dates inconsistent with known medieval preservation, older than expected but contaminated enough to prevent firm classification. Why invent ambiguity? Fabricated stories tend toward dramatic clarity. Here, uncertainty dominates. The researcher claims the lab declined publication due to provenance complications. Without verifiable source, journals refuse submission. It is entirely plausible that the material was misattributed, mishandled, or unrelated to any ecclesiastical archive. The Vatican officially denies providing biological specimens for private testing, and yet the notion persists that somewhere an unlisted fragment was analyzed quietly and the data proved inconveniently unclear. Carbon dating is precise within margins. Contamination skews results. Ancient samples require careful preparation. If a sealed specimen existed, preserved across centuries, it would challenge even modern protocols. The story offers no proof, only a suggestion that something organic, unclassified, may have briefly crossed a laboratory threshold before retreating into obscurity. And when evidence flickers without settling, it leaves behind a different kind of trace, doubt shaped like data. The Vatican has never moved quickly when confronted with disruption. When Galileo turned his telescope upward and described moons orbiting Jupiter, the response was not immediate denial, but measured resistance. Decades passed before formal reconciliation. The Church's caution was framed as defense of doctrinal stability, not hostility to observation. Officially, delay was prudence. The same pattern appears in textual scholarship. Apocryphal Gospels, Thomas, Judas, fragments discovered in desert caves were studied quietly before public statements clarified their non-canonical status. Scholars within the church examined them in depth, aware that premature disclosure could distort understanding among the faithful. In each case, silence preceded eventual transparency. The destabilizing question is not whether the Vatican delays, it clearly does, but whether delay always resolves. Astronomy was integrated. Biblical criticism found accommodation. Evolution was framed as compatible with divine intention. Institutional patience eventually gave way to clarification, but some matters remained suspended. If there were biological records tied to ancient lineage, preserved within ecclesiastical custody, the stakes would exceed interpretive nuance. Disclosure would not simply adjust doctrine, it could reshape anthropology itself. Officially, there is no such material to disclose. Therefore, no precedent applies. And yet, when we trace the rhythm of past controversies, we see a pattern: initial quiet, internal study, gradual reframing. In those historical examples, transparency arrived after consensus stabilized. Here, no consensus is formed because no claim has been acknowledged, which leaves us in a different posture. Are we witnessing the early phase of another slow recalibration? Or are we observing silence around something that may never be confirmed and therefore never reconciled? Institutional patience is familiar. Perpetual withholding is something else entirely. The remark was not recorded formally. It survives in secondhand recollection, an academic recalling a conversation with a senior archivist inside the apostolic archive. The scholar had inquired about certain restricted collections rumored to contain unconventional materials. The archivist, according to the account, paused, then offered a phrase both careful and curious. Those materials are not yet contextualized. Officially, such language is mundane. Archivists routinely describe collections awaiting proper classification, translation, or scholarly framing. Contextualization is part of responsible stewardship. Documents are not released until their provenance is understood, but the destabilizing detail lies in tone. The phrase implies existence, not denial, not absence, not myth. Something is there yet not ready. If the materials were purely theological manuscripts, context would derive from textual scholarship. If they were diplomatic correspondences, context would involve political history. What kind of artifact requires contextualization so prolonged that it spans generations? One might argue the quote is apocryphal, shaped by memory and rumor. Archivists are cautious professionals. Their words are often misinterpreted. Still, the choice of expression lingers, and not yet contextualized suggests that understanding is incomplete, not because the world lacks tools, but because the narrative into which the material must fit has not been constructed. What context could be missing? Scientific, theological, cultural? Or is the difficulty not in interpreting the object, but in preparing those who would hear its description? Modern finding aids for the Vatican archives are meticulous. Researchers can trace papal correspondence by century, diplomatic exchanges by region, theological treatises by author. Transparency, within limits, is part of the archive's contemporary ethos. And yet, among the index materials, one entry stands apart: a Templar folio, cataloged with a numeric designation but marked as restricted. The description is minimal. Associated materials, custodial, no summary of contents, no foliation count. Access requires explicit papal authorization. Officially, restricted documents are not unusual. Some involve sensitive diplomatic history. Others contain personal data protected by canon law. Access barriers are procedural, not conspiratorial. The destabilizing element is preservation without access. If a document is too dangerous to read, why preserve its catalog entry at all? It would be simpler to absorb it silently into unlisted storage. Yet here it remains, acknowledged, numbered, visible, but unreachable. Perhaps the folio contains nothing extraordinary. Perhaps it is fragile, undergoing conservation. Papal authorization may be a formality rarely requested, but the phrasing associated materials echoes earlier anomalies: custodial, lineage, separate storage. The seal on the folio remains unbroken, not because no one has asked, but because few are permitted to. When a document is cataloged yet withheld, it occupies a peculiar space, officially real, functionally absent. And absence, when once formalized, becomes its own kind of presence. The question is not merely what the folio contains, it is why the Church prefers that we know it exists, but not what it says. Imagine for a moment that a sealed container is opened. Inside, preserved biological material, authenticated beyond dispute, carbon dated to a period predating known civilizations, sequenced, compared, verified by independent laboratories. The data reveals anomalies, markers inconsistent with established evolutionary timelines, suggesting intervention or lineage beyond current models. Officially, this is fantasy, but no such artifact has been presented. No genetic sample challenges the existing framework of human descent. Science proceeds on evidence, not imagination, and yet scholars have quietly considered the implications. Theological discourse has long accommodated development, evolution integrated into doctrine, without dismantling divine creation. The soul remains distinct from biological process. Genesis becomes symbolic where necessary. Faith adjusts its language, not its foundation. But the destabilizing question emerges when biology itself appears altered. If engineered ancestry were demonstrated, would creation be rewritten or reinterpreted? Could divine authorship include delegated agents without diminishing sovereignty? Some theologians argue yes, invoking secondary causation. Others warn that introducing intermediary designers risks fracturing the singularity of origin. Academic debates circle possibility without anchor, because there is no specimen to scrutinize, no vial displayed before synod or senate, no peer-reviewed study to provoke formal response. Only hypothetical tension, belief measured against a scenario that has not materialized. The absence of evidence provides safety. Without material proof, doctrine need not shift. Without sample, speculation remains contained within seminar rooms. Yet the thought experiment persists. If a fragment of ancient biology contradicted the narrative arc from Eden to evolution, interpretation would not vanish. It would intensify. The question is not whether faith could adapt, and it is whether adaptation would preserve continuity or rewrite the story so thoroughly that the original voice becomes unrecognizable. If knowledge reshapes origin, it reshapes identity. Bioethics already navigates fragile terrain: gene editing, cloning, predictive screening. The Vatican has positioned itself as guardian of human dignity within these debates, emphasizing unity of the species, sanctity of life, and shared descent from a common source. Officially, humanity is one family. But what happens if evidence suggests layered ancestry, if certain genetic signatures imply intervention, divergence, or custodianship beyond known history? The destabilizing impact would extend beyond theology. Identity would fracture along new lines. Claims of superior lineage could resurface in dangerous forms. Political movements might weaponize genetic distinction. Unity, so carefully articulated, could erode under the weight of biological stratification. Disclosure, then, is not neutral. To reveal destabilizing data requires anticipating social consequence. The church has historically weighed such consequences heavily. Knowledge, in its view, carries pastoral responsibility, yet concealment carries risk as well. If information exists and is withheld, trust erodes once revelation occurs. Authority suffers not from content alone, but from delayed transparency. In this tension lies ethical paradox. Protecting unity may require withholding destabilizing data, but protecting truth may require release despite disruption. Officially, there is no confirmed data to weigh, and yet the framework for ethical deliberation already exists, prepared for questions not publicly acknowledged, which suggests either foresight or preparation for a possibility quietly considered behind closed doors. Imagine the archivist standing before a sealed case. Inside, perhaps, are records, biological, textual, or both, suggesting a lineage more complex than Scripture or science has yet admitted. The custodian is not scientist nor theologian alone, but steward of continuity. Officially, there's nothing to guard beyond parchment and doctrine, but if something exists, if excavation notes, preserved samples, coded manuscripts converge into implication, the dilemma sharpens. Release the material, and faith may fracture. Interpretations splinter. Authority recalibrates under scrutiny. Silence ends, but turbulence begins. Withhold it, and suspicion deepens. Whispers persist. The narrative of concealment grows larger than the content itself. The destabilizing truth is that either path carries cost. Institutions are built to endure, not to gamble. History shows careful pacing, strategic silence, or gradual integration. The Vatican has survived by absorbing shock slowly, yet some information resists slow absorption. If lineage itself were in question, if human origin included actors unnamed in catechism, the adjustment would not be minor. It would ripple through liturgy, anthropology, identity. And so the custodian hesitates. Perhaps there is nothing in the vault, no fragment, no DNA, no encoded testimony. Or perhaps there is something so destabilizing that confirmation would alter more than doctrine. It would alter self-understanding. The absence of proof sustains equilibrium. The absence of denial sustains doubt. Between those two silences, the dilemma remains unresolved. Guard the mystery, or let it speak, and risk what follows. We return to the number that did not belong. The catalog entry remains where it has always been, embedded within the 14th century Templar ledger, appended in later ink, uncorrected by subsequent archivists, in a system refined through centuries of classification reforms, digitization, and scholarly oversight. Errors are usually amended, cross-references are updated, ambiguities are footnoted. This one is not. Officially, that means little. Archives are living organisms. Anomalies persist without consequence. A marginal addition may simply have escaped review. Not every irregularity conceals intention, and yet the destabilizing detail is endurance. Multiple waves of archival modernization have passed through the Vatican. Inventories were standardized in the 19th century, reorganized again in the 20th, digitized in the 21st. Each process involved scrutiny. Thousands of entries verified, corrected, expanded. The anomalous notation survived, all of it. No clarification was added, no reclassification removed it from the Templar corpus. It remains marked as associated custodial materials. Jerusalem, an echo of earlier phrases that never fully resolve. If it were a mistake, one might expect correction. If it were insignificant, perhaps deletion. Instead, it persists in quiet neutrality, neither confirmed nor denied. Researchers who encounter it today report the same experience described decades earlier. A brief pause in conversation, a careful redirection toward officially cataloged material, awareness without elaboration. The record waits, not hidden, not illuminated. Its presence is acknowledged by inclusion, its meaning withheld by silence. And so we are left where we began, with an entry that resists both erasure and explanation, existing in the narrow space between clerical oversight and deliberate preservation. What if the digging was never physical? We have imagined tunnels beneath stone, chambers opened by torchlight, relics lifted from ancient dust. But perhaps the true excavation unfolded across parchment and clay, in script rather than soil. Official scholarship recognizes the medieval obsession with genealogy. Monastic scribes trace descent meticulously, biblical patriarchs, royal lineages, saintly ancestries. And yet bloodlines were mapped through ink long before genetics provided molecular proof. The destabilizing possibility is that the Templars were not extracting bones, but reconstructing descent. Through exposure to Near Eastern traditions, whether via Islamic scholarship or residual fragments of older lore, they may have encountered alternative origin narratives, not to verify physically, but to compare textually, to align Sumerian king lists with biblical genealogies, to test continuity across traditions. If so, the vault beneath Jerusalem becomes symbolic, less about buried matter, more about buried narrative. But then why the language of custody? Why references to samples, to guarded blood? Encoding theology biologically implies more than metaphor. It suggests material correspondence, or at least the belief in it. Perhaps the excavation of lineage through manuscripts led to a hypothesis that ancient texts were not merely stories, but records of altered descent. And if that hypothesis emerged, it might have demanded protection as though it were tangible. No shovel marks remain to verify this theory, only coded margins and ambiguous catalog entries. If the excavation was textual, then the artifact is interpretation itself. And interpretation, once encoded, can feel as solid as stone. There is another possibility, quieter than all the rest. What if nothing waits behind the sealed door? No preserved tissue, no anomalous DNA, no Templar specimen carried across sea and century. The catalog entry may be clerical residue, the ciphered margins devotional excess, the sealed annex architectural caution mistaken for secrecy. Officially, this is the most plausible conclusion. Institutions generate myth simply by existing. The Vatican, with its vast archives and historical gravitas, invites projection. Silence becomes canvas. Ambiguity becomes invitation. The destabilizing inversion is this. Perhaps the power lies not in hidden evidence, but in the architecture of suggestion. The idea that the Church might possess ancient biological records taps into modern anxieties about origin, authority, knowledge withheld by elites. It merges mythic past with genomic present, offering a narrative both ancient and contemporary. And yet the absence of confirmation sustains tension more effectively than proof ever could. If DNA were revealed and found ordinary, mystery would dissolve. If revealed and extraordinary, it would be contested, analyzed, normalized by time. But unverified possibility remains suspended, immune to disproof, resistant to closure. So we stand before the imagined vault. It may contain relics of parchment and dust. It may contain nothing at all. Or it may contain an idea so destabilizing that its mere suggestion reshapes how we read history. The record waits, whether it guards evidence or guards the story of our need for it, remains unanswered.